Family torn apart. The text that changed everything. Daniel's phone buzzed at 3:47 in the morning, and something in the quality of that vibration, something he could never explain to anyone who asked, told him that life as he had known it for 63 years was about to end. He reached for the phone with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had earned his sleep, a man whose hands had built furniture, fixed engines, and held 3 grandchildren in their first minutes of life. The screen lit up his face in the darkness of the bedroom he had shared with Margaret for 38 years before cancer took her, and the blue-white glow fell across eyes that were still adjusting, still innocent, still belonging to a man who did not yet know what he was about to read. The message was from Rachel, his daughter-in-law, his son Marcus's wife of 11 years. "Daniel, this is the last time I will ever contact you. We are done with you. Don't try to find us, don't call, don't show up. We are done. You made your choice tonight and now we've made ours. The children will not remember you. That is your doing, not ours. Goodbye forever." He read it 4 times. Then he sat up in the dark and read it 4 more. The story of how Daniel Arthur Whitfield arrived at 3:47 in the morning, sitting on the edge of his bed with a phone in his shaking hands and a family he no longer had, begins, as most tragedies do, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with 100 small cracks that nobody bothered to fill. Daniel had been a good man, he believed that. Not a perfect man, not a man without his shadows and his stubbornness, but a fundamentally decent human being who had worked a 30-year career as a machinist, raised 2 sons mostly alone after Margaret's diagnosis, coached Little League for 12 seasons, and never once in his adult life gone to bed without locking every door and window to keep his family safe. He was the kind of man who showed up. That had always been his identity, his armor, his one unassailable truth about himself. He showed up. Marcus, his older son, had always been the complicated one. Not troubled exactly, but layered, a boy who had taken his mother's illness the hardest, who had grown into a man with walls so high that sometimes even Daniel couldn't see over them. When Marcus had brought Rachel home 9 years before their wedding, Daniel had tried. God, how he had tried. He had learned her favorite foods. He had remembered her birthday without prompting. He had swallowed 100 opinions about 100 things that were none of his business, because Margaret had made him promise before she died that he would hold his sons' families together, no matter what it cost him. "Be the glue, Danny," she had said, her voice already thin and far away. "Promise me you'll be the glue." He had promised. The problem with being the glue, Daniel would eventually understand, is that nobody ever thanks the glue. They only notice it when something breaks. Rachel was not a villain. That is perhaps the hardest part of this story to hold on to, but it is the truth, and Daniel would spend months learning to hold it anyway. She was a woman who had grown up in a family where love was conditional and delivered in small, rationed portions, and she had married a man whose mother died when he was 19, and together they had built a life that was held together by control, the need to manage every variable, to see every threat coming, to never be caught off guard by loss again. Daniel understood this about them, had always understood it intellectually, but understanding a thing and navigating it gracefully are 2 entirely different skills. The grandchildren were Lily, who was 9, and the twins, Cooper and Ava, who had just turned 6. Daniel had been present at every birth. He had driven 4 hours in a February snowstorm when Rachel went into early labor with the twins. He had sat in that hospital waiting room for 9 hours eating vending machine crackers and talking to strangers about nothing, just to be close, just to be available, just to be the kind of grandfather his own father had never been. When Lily placed her small hand in his for the first time, Daniel had understood, with the full force of a man who has experienced both great love and great loss, that these 3 children were the continuation of everything Margaret had started. They were the proof that a life lived with intention leaves something behind. He had photographs of all 3 of them on his refrigerator. He had their drawings taped above his workbench in the garage. He had saved every voicemail Lily had ever left him, going back to when she was 4 years old and used to call just to tell him about her day. The argument that preceded Rachel's message had begun, as arguments between Daniel and his daughter-in-law often did, over something that seemed small and became enormous. It was Thanksgiving. Daniel had arrived at Marcus and Rachel's house at 2 in the afternoon, as agreed, with a pecan pie and the sweet potato casserole that had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations. He had also brought his younger son, Thomas, and Thomas's girlfriend, Nina, because Marcus had specifically said on the phone, "Bring whoever you want, Dad, the more the merrier." What Daniel had not known, what Marcus had apparently failed to communicate to Rachel, or had mentioned and she had forgotten, or had never said at all, because the truth of what passed between a husband and wife is never fully visible to anyone standing outside, was that Rachel had planned an intimate dinner. Just the immediate family, just the 6 of them. She had spent 3 days cooking. She had set a table for 6. When Daniel walked in with Thomas and Nina, he saw Rachel's face change. It was the work of a half-second, that change. A door closing behind her eyes, a smile arriving half a beat too late. And Daniel, who had been reading Rachel's face for over a decade, knew immediately that something was wrong, but did what he always did in those moments. He smiled wider, handed over the pie, complimented the table, and hoped that warmth would smooth over whatever fault line he'd accidentally stepped across. It didn't. Dinner was polite in the way that only deeply uncomfortable dinners manage to be, every sentence careful, every laugh a fraction too loud, the children mercifully oblivious, Lily chattering about her school play and Cooper spilling cranberry sauce and Ava falling asleep before dessert was served. Daniel helped clear the table. He washed dishes without being asked. He said thank you for everything. He left at 8 o'clock with Thomas and Nina, kissed the children goodnight, and drove home feeling the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent an entire day trying very hard and cannot tell whether it was enough. At 11, Marcus called. The conversation started calmly. Marcus was using his measured voice. The one that meant he had been talked into something he wasn't entirely sure he believed. He said Rachel had felt ambushed. He said she had needed this Thanksgiving to be a specific thing, and Daniel had changed it. He said, and this was the sentence Daniel would replay in the coming months more than any other, "She feels like you don't respect her home, Dad." Daniel, who had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm. Daniel, who had learned her favorite foods. Daniel, who had spent 11 years swallowing his opinions and biting his tongue and being the glue. He said something he shouldn't have said. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he didn't say anything cruel or deliberately wounding, but he said, with the exhausted honesty of a 63-year-old man who had run out of careful that particular evening, "Marcus, I don't know what more I can do. I have bent over backwards for that woman for 11 years, and I'm not sure she has ever once given me the benefit of the doubt." The line went quiet. "I'm going to pretend you didn't say that," Marcus said. His measured voice was gone. "Marcus, good night, Dad." The call ended at 11:23 p.m. At 3:47 a.m., Rachel's text arrived. The days that followed were the loneliest of Daniel's life, and he had buried a wife. He called Marcus 6 times over the first week. The calls went to voicemail. He left 2 messages, careful, humble messages, the kind that cost a proud man something real, and received no response. He texted. He wrote an actual letter, longhand, 4 pages, and mailed it to their address. He had no way of knowing whether it was ever opened. Thomas drove up from the city and sat with Daniel in the garage, the way they used to sit when they were working on the old truck together, and listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Thomas was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do?" he finally asked. "I don't know," Daniel said. "I don't know what there is to do." "Do you think they mean it, permanently?" Daniel looked at the photographs above his workbench. Lily in her soccer uniform, Cooper with a gap-toothed smile, Ava asleep in a hospital bassinet, 12 hours old, her whole life still entirely ahead of her. "I think Rachel means it right now," he said carefully. "I think Marcus is somewhere in the middle, and I think the kids don't know anything yet." That last sentence nearly broke him. The cruelest feature of estrangement, and Daniel would eventually find a support group of other grandparents who confirmed this, is not the adult silence. Adults can choose their silences. That is painful but comprehensible. The cruelest feature is the children, who did not choose anything and cannot be explained to, who will only understand one day that there was a grandfather who loved them absolutely and was turned away at the door. Lily's birthday came in February. Daniel bought her a gift, a telescope, because she had mentioned in September that she wanted to study the stars, and wrapped it and put it in the closet because he had nowhere to send it. He took himself to dinner alone that night and ordered a piece of chocolate cake. He didn't eat and sat in a booth by the window watching other families and tried to hold himself together with whatever was left of the glue. He started writing, not for anyone in particular, just for himself, a journal he kept on the kitchen table in one of those black and white composition notebooks he'd always associated with school. He wrote about Margaret, things he'd never said aloud. He wrote about the boys as children, about Little League and road trips, and the year Marcus broke his arm falling out of the oak tree and cried for an hour not because of the pain, but because he was embarrassed to have fallen. He wrote about Rachel, too, honestly, with as much fairness as he could muster, and in the writing he discovered things he hadn't expected to find, including the possibility that he had been, in certain moments, exactly as difficult as she had always found him. That didn't make it right, what she had done. But it made it more complicated than the story he'd been telling himself. And complicated, Daniel was slowly learning, was closer to the truth than simple ever managed to be. 7 months after Thanksgiving, Marcus called. Daniel was in the garage, sanding a rocking chair he was building for no one in particular, just to have something to do with his hands. He almost didn't answer. There was a version of himself, a version that had grown a protective shell over the winter and spring, that thought not answering might be the only power he had left. He answered, "Dad." "Marcus." A long silence, the kind that carries a full weather system inside it. "I want you to know," Marcus said, and his voice was different, lower somehow, as if it had been through something, "that I don't agree with everything that happened. I want you to know that." "Okay," Daniel said. He kept sanding. "It's complicated." "I know." "Rachel is," Marcus started again. "We've been talking. She's not ready yet, but I'm not okay with the kids not knowing you. I want you to know that too." Daniel set down the sandpaper. He pressed his hand flat against the wood of the rocking chair, solid, real, something that would hold weight. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I'm working on it," Marcus said. "It means don't give up." After the call ended, Daniel sat in the garage for a long time without moving. Outside, a late summer evening was doing what late summer evenings do, cooling slowly, taking its time, the sky going from gold to amber to the particular blue that comes just before dark. Somewhere in the neighborhood, children were playing. He could hear them but not see them, their voices carrying the loose, directionless joy of kids who have nothing to worry about yet. He picked up the sandpaper again. He kept building. The rocking chair was finished by October. Daniel put it on the front porch where the morning light hit it just right, and he sat in it with his coffee and his composition notebook, and he wrote the last entry of that particular chapter of his life. He wrote it to Marcus, and to Rachel, and to Lillian Cooper and Ava, and to Margaret, who had asked him to be the glue and probably had not known, when she made that request, what it would cost. "I am still here," he wrote. "I will keep being here, not because I have no pride left, but because my love for this family is larger than my pride, larger than my anger, larger than the hurt. I showed up the night each of you were born. I will show up for whatever comes next. That is who I am. That is who your grandmother made me." He closed the notebook. He drank his coffee. He watched a red leaf fall from the oak tree in the yard, the oak tree that had been there longer than his house, longer than his marriage, longer than his grief and his hope, and his stubborn, undefeated capacity for both. The phone on the table beside him stayed quiet. But it stayed on. And Daniel Whitfield, 63 years old, grandfather of 3, keeper of promises made in hospital rooms to women who no longer breathed. Daniel sat in the chair he had built with his own hands and waited, with the patience of someone who understood that some things worth having are worth waiting for whatever morning would eventually bring. Some families break cleanly, like glass. Others fracture slowly, like wood under pressure, and wood, unlike glass, can sometimes be repaired. You can fill the cracks. You can sand them smooth. You can build something from the broken pieces that is, if not what it was before, still solid enough to hold weight. Daniel knew this about wood. He was learning it about families.